My name is Ethan, and to this day I still refuse to use Airbnb because of something that happened during a road trip a few years ago. The strange part wasn't the house itself, it was how somebody inside the house seemed to know exactly what I was doing. I was driving through a small town and needed a place to stay for the night. Hotels nearby were either fully booked or ridiculously expensive, so I found a cheap Airbnb about 15 minutes outside town. The listing looked completely normal. The reviews were positive, the photos looked clean, and nothing seemed suspicious. When I arrived, the place was even nicer than I expected. It was an old two-story house surrounded by trees with no neighbors in sight. The host wasn't there, but he had messaged me earlier saying the key would be under a flower pot. Everything seemed fine. After bringing my bags inside, I ordered food and spent the evening watching videos in the living room. Around 9 p.m., I got up to grab a drink from the kitchen. That's when I noticed a small whiteboard hanging near the refrigerator. Written on it were the words, "Enjoying your stay?" I smiled. I assumed it was some kind of welcome message left by the host. I didn't think much of it. An hour later, I walked back into the kitchen. The message had changed. Now it said, "Good choice on the pizza." I froze. I stared at the board for several seconds. I knew exactly what I had read earlier. There was no way it originally said that. At first, I convinced myself I was just tired. Maybe I hadn't paid attention. Maybe it always said that. Still, the message bothered me. The pizza I ordered had only arrived 30 minutes earlier. How would the host know what I ordered? I erased the message and went back to the living room. When I returned to the kitchen before bed, the board had writing on it again. This time it said, "You erased my note." My stomach dropped. I immediately checked every room in the house, the bathrooms, the closets, under the beds, everywhere. Nobody was there. I even checked outside with my phone flashlight. Nothing. The trees around the property were completely still. I barely slept that night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up after hearing a loud thump somewhere upstairs. I grabbed my phone and listened. Silence. Then another thump. It sounded like somebody dropping something heavy. My room was downstairs. There shouldn't have been anyone upstairs. For nearly 10 minutes, I sat there debating whether I should investigate. Eventually, curiosity won. I slowly walked up the stairs. Every room upstairs was empty. No lights, no sounds, no people. As I turned around to leave, I noticed a folded piece of paper sitting on the floor in the hallway. I was almost certain it hadn't been there when I came upstairs. Written on the paper were 4 words, "Wrong place to sleep." I didn't sleep at all after that. I locked myself in my room and waited for sunrise. The next morning, I decided to leave early. Before checking out, I opened the Airbnb listing one last time. I started comparing the photos online with the actual house. That's when I noticed something strange. One photo showed a bookshelf upstairs, the same bookshelf I'd walked past several times during the night. But something looked different. In the listing photo, the shelf appeared much farther back than it did in real life. Curious, I went upstairs and looked at it more closely. When I pushed against the side of the shelf, it moved. My heart immediately started racing. Behind it was a narrow, hidden door. I remember standing there for several seconds debating whether I should open it. Eventually, I did. Behind the door was a cramped passageway running through the walls of the house. The space was just large enough for someone to crawl through. Inside were empty water bottles, food wrappers, flashlights, and dozens of handwritten notes. The notes described guests. One note mentioned a family with 2 children. Another described a couple staying for a weekend. Then I found the most recent page. At the top was the date, the previous night. Below it were several observations. Arrived at 4:13 p.m. Ordered pizza at 8:27 p.m. Watched videos in living room. Erased whiteboard message. Then at the bottom was one final sentence. Found the door. I dropped the paper and ran. I didn't pack my bags. I didn't take photos. I didn't call the host. I got into my car and drove straight back to town. Later that day, I contacted Airbnb and reported everything. A week later, the listing disappeared completely. I never learned who had been living inside those walls, and honestly, I don't want to know, because whoever wrote those notes wasn't watching me for one night. Judging by the stacks of papers I found, they had been watching guests for years.
The host told us not to use the upstairs bathroom. Unfortunately, we found out why. My name is Sarah, and last summer my best friend Emma and I rented an Airbnb for a weekend getaway. We had both just finished our college exams and wanted a quiet place away from the city. The Airbnb looked perfect. It was an old two-story house surrounded by trees. The nearest neighbor was over half a mile away. It wasn't modern, but it was cheap, cozy, and had great reviews. When we arrived, the host wasn't there. Instead, there was a note waiting on the kitchen counter. It welcomed us, gave us the Wi-Fi password, and listed a few house rules. One rule immediately stood out. Please avoid using the upstairs bathroom. There was no explanation. Emma laughed when she read it. That's weird. I agreed, but we didn't think much of it. The house had another bathroom downstairs, so it wasn't a big deal. The rest of the day went normally. We unpacked our things, ordered food, watched movies, and explored the property. By the time we went to bed, it was already close to midnight. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I realized I needed water. I got out of bed and opened my bedroom door. As I stepped into the hallway, I froze. The upstairs bathroom door was open. I specifically remembered it being closed earlier that evening. I stood there for a few seconds staring at it. The hallway was dark, except for a faint light coming through a nearby window. I don't know why, but seeing that door open made me uncomfortable. I walked over and looked inside. Nothing. The room was empty. I shrugged it off and went downstairs. The next morning, I mentioned it to Emma. She laughed and said I was probably just tired. Honestly, she was probably right. That day was completely normal. We drove into town, grabbed lunch, took pictures, and came back around sunset. That night, we stayed up talking until almost 1 in the morning. Eventually, we went to sleep. A few hours later, I woke up again. This time, I heard something. Water. Running water. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of a faucet running. I immediately sat up. The sound was coming from upstairs. More specifically, from the bathroom. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 3:07 a.m. For some reason, that made everything feel creepier. I got out of bed and walked into the hallway. The sound stopped. Instantly, the entire house became silent. I stood there listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. No water. Just silence. I walked downstairs and found Emma awake. Apparently she had heard it too. Now both of us were creeped out. We considered checking the bathroom, but eventually convinced ourselves it was probably old plumbing. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. No leaks. No running faucets. No signs that anything unusual had happened. But that night changed everything. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound again. Water running. Louder than before. Emma heard it too. This time we decided we were done ignoring it. We grabbed our phones and slowly walked upstairs. The sound continued the entire time. As we approached the bathroom, it became even louder. We looked at each other. Then Emma pushed the door open. The room was empty. And the faucet wasn't running. The sink was completely dry. The bathtub was dry too. The sound had vanished the second the door opened. Neither of us spoke. I felt my stomach drop. Then Emma pointed upward. What's that? Above the bathroom ceiling was a small wooden attic hatch. It was slightly open, only an inch or two, but it definitely hadn't been open before. Suddenly, every horror movie we'd ever watched started running through my head. We backed out of the bathroom and immediately locked ourselves downstairs. Neither of us slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, I called the host. The moment I mentioned the attic hatch, his tone changed. He sounded nervous. After a long pause, he finally explained. Years earlier, the house had plumbing pipes running through the attic. Whenever temperature and water pressure changed at night, the pipes would sometimes create sounds that echoed through the walls. The upstairs bathroom amplified those sounds. Previous guests had reported hearing running water, even when no water was actually flowing. As for the attic hatch, it had a broken latch and occasionally shifted open on its own. The explanation made sense, at least logically. But after spending 3 nights listening to unexplained noises in an isolated house surrounded by forest, neither Emma nor I felt much better. We checked out that afternoon. To this day, I still don't know whether the host was telling the complete truth. Maybe it really was old plumbing. Maybe the attic hatch really did open by itself. Or maybe there was another reason he didn't want guests using that bathroom. Honestly, I'm not sure I want to know.
The police later told us that if we had stayed in that Airbnb for another 10 minutes, they probably would have found us there. My name is Ryan, and this happened during a weekend trip with 3 friends. We rented an Airbnb deep in the mountains because it was cheap and completely isolated. The listing promised incredible views, total privacy, and a peaceful escape from the city. At first, everything was perfect. The house sat at the end of a long dirt road surrounded by trees. There were no neighbors, no traffic, and almost no cell service. It felt like we had the entire forest to ourselves. That feeling didn't last. The first strange thing happened about an hour after we arrived. While unloading our bags, my friend Jake suddenly stopped talking and stared into the woods. When I asked what was wrong, he pointed between the trees. I thought I saw somebody. The rest of us looked. Nothing. We laughed it off and continued unpacking. That night we ordered food, played cards, and watched movies. Around midnight, I went outside to throw away some trash. As I walked back toward the house, I noticed something. The front porch light was off. I clearly remembered leaving it on. Before I could think about it, it turned back on. By itself. I stood there for a few seconds staring at it. Then I convinced myself it was probably connected to a motion sensor. I went back inside. The next morning, things got even weirder. The Airbnb had security cameras. One pointed toward the driveway. Out of curiosity, Jake checked the footage from the previous night. At around 2:14 a.m., someone appeared at the edge of the camera. Not enough to show their face. Just a dark figure standing near the trees. Watching the house. Nobody spoke. We all stared at the screen. The figure remained there for almost 4 minutes. Then it walked back into the forest. At that point, we considered leaving. But after arguing for an hour, we convinced ourselves it was probably another hiker or someone from a nearby property. Looking back, that was a terrible decision. That evening, we decided to have a small fire outside. The atmosphere actually felt normal again. We joked around, told stories, and forgot about the camera footage. Then Jake froze. "Did you hear that?" Everyone stopped talking. Silence. Then we heard it. A whistle. Somewhere in the trees. One short whistle. Nothing else. The sound was far enough away that we couldn't tell where it came from. After a few minutes, we went back inside. Nobody wanted to admit it, but we were all uncomfortable. Around 1 a.m., we finally went to bed. I woke up 2 hours later. At first, I couldn't figure out why. Then I heard footsteps. Not outside. Inside. I immediately sat up. The footsteps stopped. My heart started racing. I grabbed my phone and checked the hallway. Nobody. I walked into the living room. Nobody. Everything seemed normal. Then I noticed the front door. It wasn't fully closed. A cold wave hit me instantly. I remembered locking that door before going to bed. I woke everyone else up. Within seconds, panic spread through the house. We searched every room. Nothing. No intruder. No stolen items. Nothing. Then Jake checked the camera feed. What we saw made all of us sick. At 2:41 a.m., the same figure appeared again. This time, they weren't standing near the trees. They were standing on the porch, looking directly at the front door. At 2:43 a.m., the camera suddenly lost signal. The next recording started almost 20 minutes later. Nobody spoke. We immediately started packing. We didn't care if we looked paranoid anymore. We were leaving. Fast. As we loaded the car, I looked toward the woods. A person was standing there, completely still, watching us. The second they realized I had seen them, they started walking toward us. Not running. Walking. That somehow felt worse. We jumped into the car. Jake started the engine. Nothing. The engine died. The figure kept getting closer. About 50 feet away. 40. 30. The engine finally started. The moment it did, the figure broke into a sprint. I've never seen anything like it. 1 second they were walking. The next they were charging directly at us. Jake slammed the gas pedal. The tires spun in the dirt. The figure kept running. For a terrifying moment, I genuinely thought they were going to reach the car. We sped down the dirt road as fast as possible. In the rear window, I could still see the person standing in the middle of the road. Watching us leave, we drove straight to the nearest police station. When officers returned to the Airbnb, they searched the area around the property. They found evidence that someone had been staying in the woods nearby for weeks. Food wrappers, blankets, makeshift shelters. The officer later told us they found evidence someone had been living in the woods for weeks. The person was never found. When I asked what would have happened if we stayed another night, he simply said, "You don't want to know."